Hello, my beautiful Sussex gang. Now, I want you to listen very carefully today, because we are about to unpack something that, in my opinion, reveals far more about the people writing these stories than it does about Prince Harry. The narrative tells us that Harry supposedly misses Britain, that he supposedly regrets leaving royal life, that apparently, according to one columnist, his humiliation is now complete. But then you read the actual argument being made, and suddenly something doesn't add up. Because if Harry is supposedly such a failure, why are they still talking about him? If he is supposedly irrelevant, why are they still demanding his return? If leaving the institution was supposedly the biggest mistake of his life, why does the same commentary acknowledge that Harry was highly effective in his royal role? And perhaps the biggest question of all, because this is where I think the narrative starts to fall apart. And Sussex gang, today I want us to look beyond the headline. Because sometimes the most revealing thing about a story isn't what it says, it's what the story accidentally admits. Let's begin with this idea that Harry's humiliation is supposedly complete. Now, humiliation would suggest failure. It would suggest that someone made a decision, that decision collapsed, and they are now desperately trying to reverse it. But look at what this commentary itself acknowledges. It acknowledges that Harry was effective in his royal role. It acknowledges that he was popular. It acknowledges that his recent visit to the United Kingdom was successful. So, hold on a minute. How exactly does a successful visit become evidence of humiliation? The fact is that Harry went to the UK. The interpretation is that he went because he desperately wants his old life back. Those are two completely different things. And this is a pattern that we have seen repeatedly. Harry does something, the media interprets why he did it, then the interpretation becomes the headline, then the headline becomes the truth. And suddenly we're expected to accept that Harry feels something simply because a columnist believes he feels it. But unless Harry has actually said, "I regret leaving," we have to be careful about presenting that as fact. And that's my issue with this entire narrative. It seems to begin with a conclusion and then work backwards to find evidence. Harry visits Britain. He must want to come back. Harry talks about his family. He must be desperate for reconciliation. Harry speaks about security. He must be trying to regain his royal status. Harry succeeds outside the institution. Well, apparently that success doesn't count. Do you see the problem? Whatever Harry does, the interpretation is already decided. And that's not analysis, that's storytelling. But here's where it gets even more interesting, because the same narrative that wants us to believe Harry is humiliated also appears to acknowledge that he was actually very good at being a working royal. Now, Sussex gang, think about that. If Harry was ineffective, if Harry was unpopular, if Harry contributed nothing, then why would anyone be so desperate to have him back? That's the contradiction. The story wants Harry to be both a failure and an essential asset, a man who supposedly made the biggest mistake of his life, but also a man whose return is apparently important enough to keep discussing. You can't have it both ways. And this is why I think we need to ask a different question. Perhaps the real issue isn't whether Harry has failed. Perhaps the real issue is that Harry has. Because when Harry was inside the institution, his worth could be measured through royal appearances, official engagements, public duties, and the traditional machinery of the monarchy. But once he stepped away, he started defining his own path. And that changes the entire conversation. Because now the question becomes Now, one of the most interesting points raised in the discussion is how selectively Harry's career is sometimes measured. Certain partnerships are mentioned, certain projects are mentioned, but then other parts of his working life seem to disappear from the conversation. His work with Better Up, often overlooked. His speaking engagements, often overlooked. His work connected to travel and conservation, often overlooked. And then there is the enormous global attention surrounding his memoir. Now, whether someone personally likes the book or dislikes it is completely beside the point. The commercial impact is a separate question, and that's where I think the discussion becomes important. You cannot claim that Harry has disappeared from public life while simultaneously discussing him constantly. You cannot claim he has no influence while dedicating endless columns, television segments, and online debates to his every move. At some point, we have to ask. That's the part I find fascinating, because sometimes the constant effort to declare someone a failure actually keeps that person at the center of the conversation. Harry doesn't need to be inside the palace to remain relevant. And perhaps that's what makes this entire situation so uncomfortable for certain commentators. Harry's story didn't end when he stepped away. It simply changed chapters. Now, I want to make something very clear. I don't think Harry's decision was ever simply about walking away from a job. This was a personal decision, a family decision, a decision involving his wife and children, and whether people agree with every choice Harry has made or not, we should at least acknowledge that he has built a life outside the traditional royal structure. He has a family, he has work, he has causes that matter to him. He has a platform, he has opportunities, he has a different kind of freedom. And perhaps the most important thing is that he has something that the media cannot easily control. He can choose where he lives. He can choose what projects he works on. He can choose when he speaks. He can choose what causes he supports. He can choose how he raises his children. And he can choose whether he wants to participate in the institution he was born into. That is a very different position from being trapped by expectations. And this is why I think the phrase, "Harry wants to come home," needs to be examined carefully. Home can mean many things. Britain can be home. A childhood memory can be home. A place can be home. But home is also the people you build your life with. And for Harry, that includes Meghan and their children. So when someone writes as though Harry can simply return to the old arrangement and everything will magically go back to the way it was before 2020, I think that misses the point entirely. You cannot rewind people's lives. You cannot erase experiences. You cannot pretend the last several years never happened. And you certainly cannot expect someone to return to exactly the same position after they have already changed as a person. Now, there was one particular idea in this discussion that I found incredibly revealing. The suggestion that bringing Harry and Meghan back into the fold would require something like a Men in Black memory wipe. Now, that statement is obviously metaphorical, but think about what it actually implies. It implies that there is a desire to erase the past, to wipe away the difficult conversations, to forget the interviews, to forget the disagreements, to forget the reasons Harry and Meghan gave for leaving, and then, after all of that is erased, simply return to business as usual. But Sussex gang, real life doesn't work like that. You cannot demand that someone tell their truth and then become angry when people remember it. You cannot say we want reconciliation while simultaneously insisting that the other person must forget everything that happened. Reconciliation isn't amnesia. Healing isn't pretending nothing happened. And forgiveness isn't the same thing as surrendering your boundaries. If there is ever going to be genuine reconciliation in any family, it has to be based on reality, not fantasy, not headlines, not public pressure, and certainly not the idea that one person must simply return to their old role and accept everything exactly as it was. And now we arrive at what I believe is the most fascinating part of this entire conversation. Because perhaps the real desire isn't necessarily for Harry to return as the person he is today. Perhaps the desire is for Harry to return as the person he used to be. The Harry who accepted the role assigned to him. The Harry who performed his duties. The Harry who absorbed the criticism. The Harry who could be compared to his brother. The Harry who could be positioned as the spare. But here's the problem, that Harry has grown up, that Harry is now a husband, that Harry is a father, that Harry has built a life beyond the institution. And perhaps most importantly, that Harry has learned that he can say no. And that's why I don't believe the real debate is about whether Harry misses Britain. I think the deeper question is whether people miss the version of Harry they once had access to. Because those are not the same thing. You can miss a person without wanting to return to the circumstances that once surrounded you. You can love your country without wanting to resume your old job. You can visit your homeland without wanting to move back permanently. And you can care about your family without agreeing to every condition placed upon you. These things can all be true at the same time. And let's talk about Meghan for a moment. Because the conversation often seems to imagine that Harry's future can be discussed independently of his wife. But that's not how families work. Harry and Meghan made a life together. They are raising children together. They have built projects together. They have faced criticism together, and whether people like it or not, Meghan is part of Harry's reality. So any narrative that imagines Harry returning to an old system while conveniently removing Meghan from the picture is not describing Harry's actual life. It's describing someone else's preferred version of his life. And there is a difference. That's why I think, Sussex gang, we have to be very careful about narratives that present Harry as a lost man who simply needs to be rescued and returned to where he supposedly belongs. Harry doesn't look lost to me. He looks like a man navigating a complicated life. He looks like someone who has made choices. Some people may disagree with those choices. That's fine. But disagreement doesn't automatically transform a decision into failure. And here's another thing. Why are we still talking about 2020 as though it happened yesterday? Harry and Meghan left. They moved forward. They created a new life. They started new projects. They raised their family. They continued their charitable work. They established themselves outside the traditional royal system. But certain commentators keep reopening the same chapter, over and over again, and then they accuse Harry of being unable to move on. Think about that irony. If Harry supposedly cannot move on, why does the media keep bringing him back to 2020? Why are we still discussing the same interviews, the same family disagreements, the same departure, the same old arguments? At some point, the obsession becomes self-perpetuating. Harry's life moves forward. The commentary circles backwards. Then the media blames Harry for the fact that the story never ends. I find that incredibly revealing. And this brings me to my biggest personal takeaway from this entire debate. For years, the narrative was that Harry needed the monarchy, that Harry needed royal status, that Harry needed the institution, that without the institution he would somehow disappear. But what if the opposite question is now worth asking? Because the moment Harry stepped away, his absence became a story. His return became a story. His security became a story. His relationship with his family became a story. His wife became a story, his children became a story, his projects became a story. Even his decision not to return becomes a story. That doesn't sound like irrelevance to me. That sounds like influence. And perhaps this is why the Harry is humiliated narrative feels so strange. Because if someone truly has no influence, you don't need to spend years explaining why they have no influence. You simply move on. But they haven't moved on. They keep writing, they keep analysing, they keep predicting, they keep speculating, and they keep asking whether Harry might come back. So maybe the real humiliation isn't Harry's. Maybe the real frustration is that Harry walked away from a system that many people assumed he could never leave, and discovered that life continued. So, Sussex gang, here is where I stand. I don't believe we should accept every headline at face value. I don't believe every columnist knows what Harry is thinking. I don't believe a visit to Britain automatically means someone wants their old job back. And I certainly don't believe that leaving an institution automatically equals failure. Harry's life is more complicated than that. His story is more complicated than that, and his future is certainly more complicated than the version being written for him by people who don't actually live his life. Maybe Harry misses parts of Britain. Maybe he misses certain people. Maybe he has complicated feelings about the past. That's perfectly human. But missing something is not the same as regretting your entire life. Visiting somewhere is not the same as moving back, and reconciliation is not the same as returning to the old status quo. Those distinctions matter. And I think the biggest lesson here is that Harry and Meghan have already demonstrated something powerful. So when the next headline tells you Harry is humiliated, when the next columnist tells you Harry is desperate to return, when the next article insists that his life outside the monarchy has somehow failed, I want you to do one thing: read beyond the headline. Because sometimes, when you actually examine the argument, you discover that the story isn't about Harry's failure at all. It's about the uncomfortable reality that Harry left. And the world didn't end. The monarchy continued, Harry continued, Meghan continued. And perhaps that's the part that some people still haven't quite come to terms with. Harry doesn't need to become the old Harry again. He doesn't need to become the spare again. He doesn't need to erase his experiences, and he doesn't need to live his life according to someone else's preferred script. He has already chosen his own chapter, and whether people like that chapter or not. So, Sussex gang, I want to hear from you. Do you think these constant stories about Harry wanting to return are really about Harry? Or are they actually about other people's desire to see him return to the role he once occupied? Do you think the media is confusing a visit to Britain with a desire to return to royal life? And most importantly, do you believe Harry has actually failed? Or has he simply built a different definition of success? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. I'll see you in the next one.